Good evening.
Well, obviously there's no need to welcome you formally after that round of applause. So I think we'll plunge right in and try and talk in some detail about that sequence we've just seen. Can we begin with the image of the children dropping the scorpions among the ants? Would you tell us first of all the origins of this image and why it comes at the beginning of your movie?
Well, first I thought it was more effective at the beginning than the end. It began in Mexico when I was working with Emilio Fernandez, who plays Mapache in the film. And we were discussing the script and its implications. And he said, it reminds me of when I was a child, and we used to put scorpions on an anthill. And the scorpions, of course, would be destroyed by the ants. At that time, I reached for the phone to order scorpions and ants and started rewriting the script. Because it seemed to me this was I'd made up my mind to play the Wild Bunch against children, or children against the Wild Bunch. And I thought this was a good way to indicate on several levels what the film was about.
And the placing of the image and the coming back to it, why at the beginning of the film?
Well, because that's what it works. I think it sets the entire feeling of the film, the pattern, and indicates, which is, I suppose, a basic philosophy within the Wild Bunch, who basically are children, that cruelty and grace are not necessarily acquired tastes, they're instinctive.
Is it significant that the children are, in some sense, deformed? There is a hunchback, for example. There's also an albino child with a skin disease.
That it was deliberate, let me put it that way. I'll let the audience and let you make your own conclusions on that. It was a deliberate move in casting. I am troubled by what is happening to children today. I think we all are. And I tried to show that on the screen. I think the only hope we have, as we've been discussing, is in the youth of this world, and so often we find them deformed, possibly by nature sometimes, but mostly by environment.
Following through this image of the scorpions and the ants, you said it works on several levels. I think obviously you're right here. Are there any other, consciously, I think you actually used the term symbol at one point in conversation. Are there any other consciously symbolic elements in the Wild Bunch?
Yes, there are, but I really don't care to discuss them. I think they're part of the film, and some of them would only have value to me. So I just as soon pass that.
Okay. Well, moving on from this, still within the opening sequence, we're very much aware that the events are happening at a particular moment in history. The military uniforms belong to the 20th century. They suggest Pershing and the First World War, whereas the community is a very traditional Western community. Is this important in the meaning of the Wild Bunch?
Well, I think it's evident, because another thing that the picture is about is a transition time in America and in Mexico, in the world actually. And we tried deliberately to show the juxtaposition of, I suppose, two forces: the force of progress, the old way, the new way, the forces of the corporation, the railroad, law and order in quotes, as opposed to the more freer life of the Western bandit whose time had ended.
Does this connect with your other movies in any way?
Well, it seems to be a reoccurring theme. I've done another picture of the Ballad of Cable Hogue, which again is a man outside of his time. And it's tied in very closely with Ride the High Country. However, I didn't go out to do this per se. It just sort of worked out that way. When I had a chance to make a film, it seemed that I would subconsciously shape it to re-examine this theme. Thank God, I figure I'm done with it now. It's Cable Hogue, and can go on to something else.
Just to push this a little further, we know you wrote the script for Villia Rides, but didn't direct the movie. Are there any elements of this transition in that movie, in that script?
To a degree. Villia Rides, the script that I wrote, was mostly dealt with the revolution per se in Mexico, which has always been a fascinating subject for me. I have not seen the film, so I can't tell you what's left of. I understand that it is not the script that I wrote, though.
There are still some images which seem to connect with you. For example, a donkey pulling an aircraft, stuff like that. Still within the first sequence, then, the conception and the playing of the bounty hunters is extremely striking. Can you recall the instructions you gave the actors playing the bounty hunters about the clothes they wear and the way they play the sequence?
Well, Strother Martin and L.Q. Jones are actors I've worked with before, and we discuss the characters they represent, and we spend a great deal of time with wardrobe until we get the feeling, and they contribute an enormous amount because they know how I work and I know how they work. It's a mutual thing.
What were the terms of the discussion then?
Well, we tried on many different outfits and things like that, but mainly we discussed character and how to represent it.
And
until they were both of them and I and the rest of the bounty hunters felt at home in their wardrobe according to their character, which is very important with actors. If the wardrobe is not right and they feel uncomfortable in it, it shows in their performance.
Right.
So we spend an enormous amount of time getting it right, so to speak.
Yeah. Now, can you recall the terms you used in actually discussing the characters with the bounty hunters, or Strother Martin and L.Q. Jones?
Well, they were pretty obscene.
Okay. You go on then and tell us.
We get into some pretty good discussions. I remember one time with a crazy actor named Warren Oates, he wanted to wear a barbed wire vest, and I had to convince him that wasn't the case.
Sort of depressing on this, but about the characters of the bounty hunter, did you actually formulate them in words with Strother Martin and L.Q. Jones?
How do you mean?
Were you saying we're trying to aim at this particular kind of character?
Well, they recognized the characters they were playing instantly from the script, and it was a question of giving it body and depth. And the script is words on a piece of paper. Actors bring the words to life. And we had a great wardrobe man, who was inspired, named Gordon Dawson, and we all worked very closely together to try to bring a sense of reality.
I think there's one particular prop that Strother Martin wears, a cross with a bullet on it.
Yes. Well, I decided not to. At one time I was going to have a church and a priest and do a number on that relationship to the revolution. But that's a different story. And so we worked out the cross and the bullet as
condensation of this.
As a small comment on what was going on in Mexico at that time.
Yeah. Just briefly to go back, you raised the question of, rather I raised the question about the cross and the bullet. To go back to the image of the scorpions and the ants, we see the final images of the burning of both these, and at the same time we hear on the soundtrack the voice of the Temperance Union guy talking. Now, why did you overlap these sound and image?
And I wanted to progress the picture, and I thought that they were apropos to each other, rather than making a conventional ride into town. We had about 4 elements working in this opening sequence, and I tried to juxtapose them so that they all tied in.
Right.
And I think it was relevant.
And back onto the bounty hunters, the particular conception of them, obviously I would call them subhuman, animal-like. Do they connect to you with figures in your other movies?
Oh, yes, I think so.
What sort of
To
people?
a degree. There's certainly a bit of the Hammond brothers in...
Played by much the same actors, L.Q. Jones, for
except
example.
that the Hammond brothers really became the Koch brothers.
Right.
And again, I was saddled with that shabby actor, Warren Oates.
Yeah. I understand he's around in London.
Well, I hear he is.
Yeah.
I hope not, because I try to get as far away from him as possible.
I understand that.
He not only has the bad taste to be a fine actor, but he married the most beautiful woman in London, too. Stand up, Warren. Stand up. I think I'll let you answer the rest of the questions, too.
To move on, but still within the opening sequence, we see the young crazy member of the gang half jocularly forcing his attention on an elderly lady. Does this kind of sexuality, a rather predatory, violent, joyless kind of sexuality, does it follow a pattern throughout the Wild Bunch?
Well, I hope it does, because the Wild Bunch are criminals with, I would say, a limited mentality. Certainly, they're not the Western hero of the myth, the Hollywood myth. And the people that I know, and I know quite a few, with the same kind of emotional background and makeup, who live for violence, this is the way that this is the way they react to love, to sex, to beauty. It's a secondary thing in their lives. It's usually in a whorehouse, a brothel, or something like that. And, they are limited men, which was the point, again, that this is not William Holden playing a hero. This is William Holden playing Pike Bishop, who's a criminal.
Is this, yet at the same time, it's not altogether unpleasant, the sexuality in the Wild Bunch? I mean, the actresses who play the whores, for example, extremely beautiful. Does this mitigate the violence of it in some sense?
Well, I don't know. Some whores are very beautiful, you know?
That's it.
And make charming companions on occasion. I don't know. Warren, you were in that wine vat. Whatever happened when I left? I thought that again, with this particular kind of bunch of people, or this type of men, they're inclined to be like children, and there are moments of delight and joy and horseplay and things like that.
Why did you handle the violence as you did?
Because I thought it had validity in this form. And these, again, are men who live for violence, not as a means to an end, but as a means in itself. And there are a lot more of them around than we have any idea. When I merely shot it and represented it as I thought it had dramatic validity.
Can I press you a little on this and ask, why did it take the form of slow motion rather than, say, animation of the frame?
Well, if you've ever been in a fight, or in battle, or in a car accident or something, I think you'll notice that time seems to stretch out for you. For an example, when Yolanda and got trampled by the horse. This was not a dummy. This was a very lovely woman. I thought it went on for an hour. Actually, it was only, I think, about 3 seconds. But the moment stretched forever. And I've noticed that before with my own reactions, and I tried to incorporate that into this film, in the battles, to hold on to a moment. Because I try to involve the audience in the battles to make you become part of them. And that's a technique I used.
Are you dissatisfied in any way with the Wild Bunch?
My God, yes. I'd like to start rewriting and reshooting and recutting and everything. But I always feel that way about a film.
Could you be specific about any things in it?
Yes, I think the film is being shown in England right now. I think the flashbacks are awkward. I'd like to reshoot them and recut them. At least, I think the censor has hurt the picture deeply. In fact, has almost destroyed the purpose of it in the last fight by taking out some of the bloodshed and almost, instead of making it as horrible as I want it to be, it's almost, as somebody once said, a strange exaltation. It's now almost appealing rather than being as bad as it was at one time. I think they're defeating their own purpose by cutting this out. It's the same thing that happened in Major Dundee. The battles there were very similar to these. They were cut down, and so instead of seeing some truth, we had fun and games in Apache land. And I think that's a pain in the ass. I really think that violence is... I think we're all prone to it, but we ought to look at the face of it. It's ugly. And people die, and when they do, it's not pretty.
What about the sequence, the battle sequence at the railroad? I understand you're a little dissatisfied with the way it exists in the film.
No, it's been cut. There are 2 or 3 minor cuts that I'd like to change. Other than that, I was going to have it printed in black and white and try to do a newsreel effect. It was shot like in a newsreel technique. But I thought, after looking at the film, I thought we'd better leave it the way it was. However, this has been, in that battle, is one of the most important moments in the film between the general and the little boy. At the present time, that sequence has been cut in the runnings in the United States, but I understand it's going to be put back in because the critics there have protested enough that Warner Brothers is going to put it back in. I hope they are, anyway. See, because Mapache and his people were exactly the same people that represented by Angel in his village, which was a point that I wanted to make.
Well, I think the projectors might have the second battle sequence ready for us to see at the moment. If this is laced up, can we look at this? Let's sit down there.
Now about violence.
Right, at this point, I think we'll allow the ants to get a chance of getting at the scorpion. Question? Please raise your hands if you want to ask a question.
One fairly straightforward question. I've seen that final battle scene 3 times, and I'm visually terrified. Quite horrified by it as a whole. You said earlier on you wanted it more horrible and more violent than that. Aren't you afraid you'd end up with an empty cinema? You either forcibly hold down its speed.
No, I don't think so. I think there's about 40 feet cut out that should be in. I think we're just missing. No, I think possibly you're horrified and delighted you are. But I think some people are not as horrified as they should be.
There are a number of things I'd like to ask about the the scripting in terms of the incredible amount of nuances that you put into this film. There's two scenes that I think stand out as sheer masterpieces. The scene, I say this not because Warren Oates is here, but
Can you speak up, please?
the scene after they robbed the train and they stopped, and they passed the bottle around, and everybody except Lyle gets a drink. And it's such an incredible rapport that develops between men. It's never said. They just know they're going to take the piss out of it. And they pick him. Each one of them knows the bottle goes around. He knows before they get the bottle finished that he's not going to get a drink. And he plays Paxton. Can you tell us how you developed that scene? And also, the scene where the boy runs up to Mapache. He idolizes him so much. And as you say, you're trying to show that Mapache and his people are very much like angels. The boy idolizes Mapache so much, and for one instant, Mapache just realizes how he's covered it and plays to the boy, which I thought was beautiful. The ironic fact is that Holden is killed, the last shot, by a boy. Why didn't you make it the same child that ran to Mapache? I'm sorry, there's two very disassociated questions.
Well, I can answer the second half of that very easily because Rene Duprion, unfortunately, a mistake of one of our production people, had been sent home. But you happen to be one of the few people who've noticed that it wasn't the same boy. A lot of people thought it was. I tried to get away with it, but in your case, I failed. We couldn't get him back from Mexico City at that time. And, the bottle passing is, well, the part played by Warren was one that, throughout the picture, set up a certain amount of attrition between the group and also a certain amount of humor, and I think it built rather nicely. It was planned that way. As I said, this type of human beings, men of violence, are often childlike, and it's drinking is a particular form of their game. And I think the important thing that began it was the fact that Holden getting on his horse with a certain degree of bravado and having brought off the robbery successfully, when Tector Gorge offers him a drink, it's a moment of almost awkward sentimentality, which I think is alleviated by the fact that we do a little number on Warren then. At least that's the way I planned it.
The sequence at the end of Massacres, latest film, Time to Die, where the action is slowed down in a rundown.
I don't know which film you're speaking of.
Is it called A Time to Die? It was shown to us in the rough cuts here. And I think it was also Ballad.
That's right. He went on that just after he finished Cable Hogue. I haven't seen it. I read the script. But I don't know. I haven't seen the film, and I don't know what Bud is doing these days. So.
I've never seen this slowing down the action before. At such a moment, to just sort of display how much goes on. I wondered if you were aware of any previous...
No, I used it in television, in the Westerner, and I also used it... it started out with a fight between Brian Keith and Neville Brand, and both of them were so fast that I couldn't get it on film. They were a little angry at each other at that time, too. It was almost a full-bore knockdown and drag-out. But after that, then I would try to overcrank a little bit. And then in The Losers, I made an extensive use of both undercranking and overcranking. And in Major Dundee, I had exactly the same pattern, shall we say, of slow motion. I had a great horse fall in slow motion at about 90 frames, which I intercut the battle with, but it was taken out by Mr. Bressler as being... unrealistic or something.
At this point, I think we've got another extract lined up from The Deadly Companions, which was Sam's first movie.
I don't know whether I want to see this or not.
Well, it doesn't need much setting into context. It comes very early in the movie. The central figure is played by Brian Keith. He's called Yellowleg. He's an ex-Union soldier, a very morose figure, who, for reasons of his own, saves Turkey, played by Chill Wills, from hanging, and then teams up with Turkey and Billy, played by Steve Cochran, in order to rob a bank. So we enter the Deadly Companions very early on in the movie. In what sense is religion important in your movies?
I suppose in every sense. In my family, I've been involved in various religions. And I appreciate them all. But I do have some questions, which I try to find some answers to, and when I don't, I pose the questions in the film, whether the saloon is a church or the church is a saloon, or in the great classic tradition, whether the theater is a church. I think, actually, the church began as a theater. I'm fascinated, obviously, by the pioneer aspect of religion and all its various labels and means and ways of getting to basically the same thing. I'd like to say that I pose questions. I really don't have too many answers.
As you pointed out, there is a tension between the idea of the brothel as church, the saloon as church, or the church as saloon. Also in Guns in the Afternoon, there's the brothel as church, the idea of the marriage celebrated here. You seem to bear tremendous tension in your work in that sense, possibly perhaps a certain moral ambivalence. Would you agree?
Yes, I would. I would have been happy to say otherwise, but as I said, I have a great many questions, and I am concerned, and there's a great dichotomy, I think, between churches, saloons, and brothels, which possibly should be brought together. I don't know. Maybe I'm a pagan, I have no idea.
Specifically about Guns in the Afternoon, which regrettably we can't show today. You'll note, of course, in America is Ride the High Country. Is there a very, very strong, extra strong religious strategy in that?
Yes. I think that, again, this is an enormously personal thing that goes back to my upbringing, to my family, who are both ranchers and farmers and lawyers and judges. And again, it's not what I say, it's what I do kind of theory that seems to keep appearing as I remember. So again, I present questions that I never heard my people answer satisfactorily to me, and I'm still looking for an answer, I suppose.
Could you relate that specifically to Guns in the Afternoon?
Well, Steve Judd is a moral man, in quotes. And in fact, he's the first one to tell you about it. And yet he makes all the mistakes. He breaks his code again and again and again. And yet he's the man who, despite this failing of his honor in a humanitarian fashion, does enter his house justified. I thought that was an interesting piece of irony.
Could you say something about the conception of the Knudsen farm as opposed to Coarse Gold, the town, in Guns in the Afternoon? Does it exist in religious terms?
Well, the San Joaquin Valley and Coarse Gold and Madera County and Fine Gold took their religion very strongly, and the Knudsen farm was one that I was familiar with. Mr. Knudsen, of course, I trust is familiar to everybody, fanatics along these lines. And I merely wrote and directed from experience. Obviously, that I think any man who considers himself totally right is in trouble. There was a play written by William Saroyan many years ago about two artists in a garret. And they're starving to death during the Depression. And they're arguing. One is a painter and one is a writer. And they're discussing theory. And one artist says to the other artist, he said, "Do you mean to tell me you wouldn't die for what you believe in?" And the other said, "No, I might be wrong." I like that very much.
Time for the ants again. Anyone want to raise a question with Sam about this? Just a moment, over here, please. Just a moment. You.
It's just a very short question. I want something's bothered me about the wildlife, the detail, and maybe a silly detail, a tremendous firepower that the wildlife has seems to depend on pump-action shotgun. It seems to be the film is very precise in so many ways, meticulous in detail, and I'm wondering whether this is not an anachronism. They have such shotguns.
Yes, they were used in the trenches in 1914. All the weapons and arms are authentic. Deliberately so. The use of automatic weapons, the machine gun, the 45s, etc. That preceded a new age, and while they could use the weapons, they couldn't quite identify with the change in time.
I'm just saying, there's a banging coming from the back of the stage.
I thought it was me. I didn't know, but who is that? I see.
No control over it.
Mr. Peckinpah, earlier on talking about the wild, you mentioned how many violent people are on society today. Are you concerned that violent people might be entertained by the wildlife, which are worried about?
Yes, I am. I think that in some instances we have drawn the line thin enough, they're going to be entertained no matter how much blood I put on the screen. But again, possibly through pity and fear, some form of catharsis, they can get it out of the system. Other people can look at it and maybe see themselves, the mirror of their own violence and what's up on the screen.
Don't you think that the exposure to so much violence means that perhaps there'll be people will become indifferent to it?
No, I don't think so. I think they become indifferent to it when you see films where people are shot and there's gratuitous violence. I think that I got so fed up with the Hollywood Western, per se, the fun and games approach to killing, that I tried to show that it is fairly ugly and horrible. The fact is that there's a certain poetry and fascination in it, is the other side of the coin, which I think is the instinctual side of the coin, which goes back a long time before we knew how to write.
I mean, over the next 20 years, we can expect a lot more violence in cinema. And so perhaps you don't think that there'll be any reaction, to it, completely indifferent. As in war, for instance, when a young man is horrified when the first person he killed, but after that just becomes nothing.
I hope not. I hope that we never become immune to it. I hope we look at it and realize that it's part of all of us, and it's the part that has to be controlled and directed in some other way. You might be right. I hope not. I desperately hope not.
I think we have another extract lined up. And this time from Major Dundee, which was Sam's third film. And if I briefly set it into context, the Major Dundee is a Union officer played by Charlton Heston. He's in command of a prison fort for Confederate prisoners of war. The setting is a Civil War. And he leads out his command on a punitive expedition against the Apache. His command is made up of Union soldiers, some of them Negroes, Confederate prisoners, and some civilians. The command is therefore cut across by national and racial tensions. And up to a point, it's unified in the heat of battle, but the latent tensions remain. We enter the film as one of the tensions explodes. Would you like to talk about the conception of Dundee and
No, I'd like to talk
Irene?
about the dubbing.
Okay.
On both pictures, I had nothing to do with it. And one of the problems I had after both those shows was I object to people speaking out of sync.
Do you want to talk about Dundee and Tyreen now?
No, I want to get a hold of Jerry Bressler. I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Right, let's move on to the...
I'd like to speak briefly about the function of a director and the function of Hollywood producers. It seems that most Hollywood producers have an idea that looping is something that is a mechanical operation. Well, it's not. It's more important sometimes than actual filming. As you saw today, there's Warren giving a fine performance, and he's at least, 8 frames out of sync most of the time, as was some of the people in The Deadly Companions. That's why I make every effort now to stay with the picture till its final release point. If you don't, things like this can happen, and it's one of the reasons that I was so distressed with Dundee, besides the enormous amount of mutilation that happened to the picture. I've said my piece.
Okay.
I apologize for it. I actually should never have made the picture in the first place. If you don't have a chance to do your work and to supervise some of these things, it's really not worthwhile to get involved.
Does that imply that the system is wholly bad, then, the Hollywood system?
Well, I got very lucky in the last picture because it was a Ken Hyman system, which is really not a Hollywood system at all. And that was very good.
Does that imply that if you're working in Hollywood, one should try to have the greatest degree of freedom?
If you're working in Hollywood, you should know damn well who you're working for and with. Otherwise, this kind of disaster can happen to you. I think it's very important that a director and producer understand exactly together what kind of a picture they intend to make. Obviously, Mr. Bressler was going to make another kind of a film, which he did.
More general questions now. Have you been consciously influenced by any other filmmakers or by any particular films?
I don't think consciously. I think unconsciously I've been influenced by every good picture I've ever seen. I'd be very happy to admit that I lie, cheat, steal, anything to make my picture better, to get it on the screen. I admire so many good directors, from Michael Curtiz to Kurosawa to David Lean, John Huston. If you enjoy a good film. I enjoyed a tremendous film called Last Year in Marienbad. I saw it 3 times. Very disturbing film, and I think a very important one.
In what sense important?
Well, I think it had dealt with the subconscious, I think, more effectively than any other film ever has. And I can't tell you what the story's about, and yet inside, it disturbs me, and I'm involved in it.
What was that film again?
Last Year in Marienbad.
With what directors and in what films have you worked as dialogue director or in any other capacity?
I worked on, I think, 11 films. 3 films with Don Siegel, who really was responsible for my getting a start in motion pictures, and a couple of films with Charles Marcus Warren, and one with Jacques Tournier.
Could you name the films, please?
In The Riot in Subblock 11, I wasn't a dialogue director. I was a 5th assistant location casting director. But we got it on. It's interesting, The Deadly Companions was shot in 19 days, so possibly that's why it's out of sync. But the other show was 7 Angry Men with Charles Warren, and Great Day in the Morning with Jacques Tournier. But I was an actor in those days. I played bank clerks and meter readers and all kinds of marvelous things. It's no fun being in front of a camera. I found that out.
Okay, at the moment you're finishing off the Ballad of Cable Hogue. What comes after that?
I have no idea. I would like to, not to make a film for a while. I'd like to fill up the well again. I've been working straight for the last 30 months on these 2 pictures, and I intend to spend some time with my son, Matthew, and my other kids, and learn what it's about. I seem to have lost touch now.
I understand you own several properties which you'd like to film.
Well, I own one in particular, Castaway, a James Gould Cousins novel that I bought some 10 years ago that I want to make with Per Oscarson. Possibly some of the audience has seen the film, a TV show that I did with Per Oscarson and Jason Robards called Noon Wine. And we had a very fine relationship at that time, and I'd like to work with him again.
Are there any further questions you want to put? Up at the back, please.
Do you consider yourself a visual historian in the Jack Schaefer, Alan May, Frank O'Rourke tradition, who just happens to work in film instead of writing?
No, I've always wanted to be a director. I consider myself to be just out of the 4th grade and ready to go into the 5th. And I need a lot more study before I do.
The women in your film, Centerburger and especially in Wild Bunch, they all seem very, very modern in comparison to the men, who are not having a big head, all bushy and ugly.
Get him, Warren. Stop him.
Well, the women are very different.
Centerburger was the result of a compromise I made, which turned out, and God bless her, she's a marvelous lady, but there should have been no women at all in Major Dundee, and there wasn't until somebody at the studio suggested that we needed a woman in the show. And consequently, we have a woman in the show. The women in the Wild Bunch some are actresses of enormous talent, such as Aurora Clavel, Elsa Cardenas, Elizabeth Duprion, and Sonia Amelio. The other are prostitutes and girls from the street. The girl in the last scene with Holden is not an actress.
I was thinking more with Mapache. Get a very, terribly groovy girl around.
Well,
Terribly modern. I know,
if you dig Mexico like I do and float around a little bit, you'll find out there's some very groovy chicks.
All your films to date have been westerns, haven't they? Sort of rather period pieces, you might say. Do you choose this deliberately because it gives you a freedom to say things you want to say, or are there any contemporary things?
No, I because of my experience writing Gunsmoke scripts and the Westerner series, which I created, and The Rifleman, I became typed as a Western director. That's what they paid me to do. And I work because, one, I love it, but two, I need money to live. And within that frame, then, I tried to do kind of a different story. I hope now I don't have to do any more Westerns for a while, although I do have one I want to do very much, but I'm tired of horses. I'd like to shoot, that's why I loved shooting the train in the Wild Bunch. My God, for once I was... It's very hard for actors to get on horses when they're running from a bank robbery or something like that. You spend days and days and days trying to get the shot. I'd love to shoot some automobiles,
How did you achieve the effect of blood being spurted out of the victim in the Wild Bunch?
We
Was it the first time you used that effect?
No, we shot them. It was considered to be a little brutal, but realism, we must...
There's someone up here. Hold it a moment.
No, it's actually a small explosive that's put against a piece of asbestos and blows through a blood capsule with a charge.
Okay.
Just a small point, but why did they go back for Angel and yet they didn't go back for Sykes? where the odds were much more than the Mediterranean, but presumably easily have gone and picked up sight of the lake.
And actually, they didn't go back for Angel. They kind of backed their way into it. It was Thornton who forced them back into the village. It was a series of circumstances that made them look at what they were.
It was a conscious decision, wasn't it? When they came out of the Park House, they got together before them and...
Yes, at that point. But the decision to go back into the village was because they didn't want to run. They wanted protection and sanctuary in this village. But after a certain length of time and introspection, they decided that it wasn't worth it.
The next one will have to be the last one, I'm afraid.
In the Wild Bunch, I've heard critics say that they think the gun has taken the place of the phallic symbol. It is a phallic symbol. Apart from the fact this will make the Wild Bunch probably the sexiest film ever made. Do you think this is a intellectualized film or what?
Anybody who's ever been in the service or involved or knows people like this, I don't think it's necessarily a phallic symbol. I think it's a means of killing somebody. At least that was the approach we had to it. Whatever other activities we had were certainly not done with guns. And there was a lot, too, really.
I think this is a very appropriate note on which to close. So on behalf of the NFT audience, Mr. Peckinpah, thank you very much for coming along.
No, thank you. It was an honor. I'm delighted. I hope you enjoy Cable Hogue when it comes out. Thank you.